hitting all of the stuff that
the most boring stuff.
Well, it's not
hitting.
it's a little bit drier, but I mean this stuff is hugely relevant, and people can't get this information anywhere else. The only way they could do is read your Tumblr, and my understanding is that's going away because of the porno thing. So
I will not use eggplant emojis anymore.
Wait, what?
Let's just say that.
What's happening? What?
Tumblr has a new rule about getting rid of adult content, and I made a joke about that.
Sorry, I didn't know
because,
anything about
David
that. Sorry,
Dayen-
Matt. Okay.
Basically, all the stuff remaining on Tumblr.
Right, exactly. Okay. And David Dayen's basically home for his clearinghouse of his reported pieces.
Side
links, which
links.
You know, I mean, they've been Tumblr's been flagging things like Taylor Swift sitting on a chair. Like we don't know. This could violate our
Sam,
adult.
There was a flag on the postal report.
You're into that, right?
All right, yeah. Oh, totally.
Taylor Swift sitting on a chair.
All right. Well, let's talk about the postal report, and then we'll get to what's going on in Michigan and Wisconsin, and a little bit. I also want to talk about what's happening in the House. But the postal report came out. Who commissioned the report? What were the purposes?
This was a Trump executive order. So Trump put an executive order to start a task force on the future of the US Postal Service, which has been losing money for a variety of different reasons that we'll go into. You mentioned one of them.
That's the biggest one,
the
isn't it?
pre-funding reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, but for that, they would be still, on the road to profitability, if not profitable. But email has degraded the ability of the Postal Service to continue. So this was a task force to determine. And now a lot of people saw it in the context of Trump going after Amazon, saying they were cheating the Postal Service, that they were underpaying for package delivery through the parcel post program. And so this was a task force designed to create recommendations. For the Postal Service, it was seen at the time as sort of a stalking horse for privatization, which we've seen around the world at several postal services. They've privatized their agencies. I would say in the U.S., the Postal Service is a partially privatized agency. It does not get any money from the U.S. government outside of some very minuscule things for government postage. It has a board that's appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, but they kind of have independent. With some statutory restrictions, but they're kind of independent governance. So the
and for
question
the most part,
was,
don't get taxpayer money.
No, $0.
It's all from the stamps.
So the question was, was this task force going to recommend privatization completely? And it didn't actually recommend privatization, but it recommended something I think much worse.
Really?
And that is the degrading of the universal service obligation. Now, what is the universal service obligation? That means neither sleet nor snow nor dead of night will keep us from reporting rounds. It means that everyone in the country, every residence, every business, no matter where you are, no matter how much it costs to get there, gets mail. The furthest reaches of Alaska, the most rural area in South Dakota or wherever, you're going to get your mail, and you're going to get it 6 times a week, and you're going to get a standard rate for letters from any part of the country to another, standard rate for packages and things like that. That's the universal service obligation. And what the report said is that we need to redefine the universal service obligation. Those
are my favorite universes, which don't include all of the universe. They're much easier to manage.
Yes, that's right. And there's some contradictions in the report, because the report says that the one thing we don't want to do is hurt rural Americans who rely on the Postal Service, especially because the digital divide is still pretty large. But in practice, all of the things that it wants to do, which is they want to sort of define essential services. So like person-to-person correspondence, bill paying, government mail, transport of pharmaceuticals for some reason is in there. Those things would be essential services. That would still be universal. Everything else, like commercial packages, like from Amazon, would be inessential and then subject to increased rates, and also potentially subject to discontinuance of delivery. The term they use is exiting the business line. So they could, certain packages are like, I'm not going to middle of Alaska with that package. You can't do it in the Postal Service. So that would be, and who would that fall on, right? It would fall on rural customers.
Of course, because it's going to be most expensive to go to a rural customers. And this is really fundamentally...
Competition would start kicking in.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Competition would start kicking in, and then you would see just
already,
even
by
more
the way,
people not go there.
Already, UPS and FedEx don't deliver to certain places. There's FedEx has a thing called a delivery area surcharge, where if it's a hard to get area, they add money to deliver to that particular locality. So that's what you would see, a two-tiered system, basically. And
that is among other issues. That is one of the fundamental problems with privatization of the Postal Service, is that it is simply not profitable to do. And I don't know if you've seen any numbers to this effect, but there is probably 10 to 15%, maybe more, of what the post office does that almost cannot be profitable.
Right.
Like, you cannot have delivery service to the farthest regions of the country and make it profitable.
And when you're thinking about that, you have to think in terms of, what is the Postal Service for? Is it for making money for itself and for the United States? Or is it to, as it says in the statute, bind the nation together?
Right.
The whole point is to, give everybody the ability to acquire information, conduct commerce, no matter where you live, no matter who you are, no discrimination against any member of society. You can use the Postal Service. Now, in the 1800s, it was much more vital part of communication. This is why, magazines and newspapers have a reduced rate of delivery,
right,
relative to the other parts of packages and mail. But even today, particularly in these rural areas, it's incredibly important to have reliable mail service. And if you're saying to an area,
particularly because they don't have the same broadband of the internet, because now all of a sudden the digital divide adds to, if you were to diminish postal service, the divide that exists in terms of information because of the digital divide becomes that much even steeper, like and disparate.
So while this didn't call for privatization, it embraces the logic of privatization.
Right.
The logic of, we have to turn a profit, we have to cover our costs on everything that we do, every little business line that we engage in.
If a Democratic president ever called for a report like this, a report like this was produced during a Democratic administration, first off, I would be upset because it's fundamentally contrary to some of the points of having a Democrat in office. But the New York Times would be writing about how the coastal elites think that the heartland people and rural people are not worth expending any money on. This would be a huge, like, we would hear this in the Senate. This would be the war on Christmas, right? It would be the war on rural people. But because it comes out of the Trump administration, nothing.
And by the way, it goes further than just not delivering certain packages. It says that it should be easier to close post offices. And where are those post offices going to be closed? There are 31,000 locations in rural areas where it's unprofitable.
Yes.
It talks about slowing down the speed of processing mail in places where it's unprofitable. So maybe you can get your mail in a rural area, but it'll be once a week instead of 6 days a week.
Going back to the Pony Express.
Yeah.
What about drones?
And
you guys are anti-future.
And then it talks about raising, how can we make the Postal Service cover its costs, revenue enhancement options. And it talks about like hunting licenses and fishing licenses you can sell at the post office. But it specifically says...
no banking.
Yes. It specifically says Expanding, I'll quote here, expanding in the sectors where the USPS does not have a comparative advantage or where balance sheet risk might arise, such as postal banking, should not be pursued.
Now, for folks who are new to the show, if you had listened to this show in like 2014 or 15, you would have heard probably more about postal banking than in any other medium that existed except for print.
It is why your audience was cut in half during that era.
Exactly. And had Hillary Clinton won, this would have been all postal banking all the time. Right. But just briefly remind people why this would be such a great idea.
Right. So in the United States, there are significant amounts of people who have little or no access to banking services. Either they don't have the ability to get a bank account at all, or they have one, but they also use all these alternative sources like pawn shops or payday lenders or whatever. And those services charge extortionate rates. The average is something like, I think it was $2,500 a year in interest and fees on these alternative financial services for the average family. And these are families making $25,000 a year.
Right.
This
It's
is like
insane.
10% of their total income
insane.
just on fees for conducting, being part of the financial system. And in a modern economy, if you're not part of the financial system, you can't get a job or rent a car. I mean, there's so many things you can't do. So the idea would be to go back to something we had from 1911 to 1967, where the post office provided a postal savings account that anyone could access that would give you the ability to have an ATM card, that would give you the ability to conduct financial transactions. And it would be a way to promote financial inclusion, which is squarely within the mission of the U.S. Postal Service to bind the nation together.
Right.
So this would not only help a little bit on the Postal Service's finances. You could charge vastly less for lending services or things like that in terms of interest. So families would save 80%, 90% in fees and interest. But the Postal Service would make a little bit of money, and more important, promote financial inclusion.
After Medicare for all, that's my
That's number two.
That's number two on my bucket list.
But this task force said no, can't do that.
Well, but this task force is just going to be operative during the Trump years, right? I mean, theoretically, right?
Right. But I mean, the logic of it, I think, is going to endure to a certain extent.
I hope so. All right.